Hi, I'm Sari Kerr from Wellesley Centers for Women, and I will be telling you about a recent study that I did related to educational choice and information. And this is actually a randomized field experiment we did in Finland a couple of years ago, where the results are now finally in. And today I will be giving you some information about the gender pay gaps and how this research is actually related to women in the labor market. We all know that gender pay gaps tend to be universal. They happen in every country, very similar in Finland as in the US. And we also know that today women tend to outperform men in educational attainment. So young women get more education than men, but they also tend to select fields of study that lead to lower paid occupations. And this is how gender occupational segregation begins. It begins with the choice of education. In fact, about half of the gender pay gap can be explained by the choice of education and occupation. And today, and in this study, we actually showed high school students what is the effect of degree programs on earnings later on in life. And this kind of information will help us evaluate whether the choice of lower paid occupations or lower paid education for women is due to lack of information, or whether these choices might reflect preferences or other factors that we haven't fully understood. And like I said, this is a study we did in Finland. The Finnish education system is slightly different than in the US, but the high schools are fairly similar. So we intervene in the last year of high school. This study, we sort of intervene in the fall of the last year of high school. The students graduate in the spring. They apply to universities and polytechnics during that spring. And if all goes well, in the next fall they are studying somewhere in a university program or in a polytechnic program. Those are the two types of higher learning institutions that Finland has. And I'll just preview the results very briefly before I'll tell you more about the experiment and the evidence that we have collected. So we have done a survey in about a quarter of Finnish high schools. We randomly selected schools to participate in this. We asked the schools if they would like to be a part of the study. And in those schools that were part of the study, we did surveys. We have about 5,000 students who responded our survey. And those responses show that girls in general and boys from low education backgrounds are not very well informed about the effect of degree programs on earnings. So there is some gap in the knowledge that we can address. Girls tell us that they care about the salary, but even more than salary and employment, they care about their interest in the job. So this is a factor that needs to be considered. And girls are also more often than boys negatively surprised about the expected earnings in the fields that they are aiming for at the time of this experiment. When we go through and analyze the whole information experiment, we see actually no changes in the girls' applications or enrollment as a result of the new information that we offer. But we do see some changes in the application patterns for boys who live in less educated neighborhoods. And so that's the extent of the results today. And I will tell you a little bit more about the intervention that we did. So, like I mentioned, we had about a quarter of Finnish high schools randomly selected to participate. Not all of them did, but we had upwards of 60 schools in the study. We went into those schools basically via the student guidance counselors, and they generously offered to take our experiment during one counseling class during the fall of 2011. And we prepared a presentation for the student guidance counselors that was related to the sort of general effects of education on employment and wages by field and level. We discussed the length of studies and entry rates to various programs, and we also provided the students a much more detailed information package that we encouraged them to take home. And the class ended with a survey that we did. So students answered various questions relating to their future plans for studies, their information, but where and how much information did they have at the time of the study in terms of the labor market returns of education, and what the sources of information were that they relied on. We also surveyed them about the factors that they considered important when they were selecting educational degree programs, and also had questions that were meant to attract their attention to the information package, so that we would actually know that they looked at the information and took some of that home. And so, like I mentioned initially, girls tend to outperform boys in terms of educational attainment. And in the survey evidence, this is also evident. So girls are more likely than boys to say that they desire to get university education, which is the highest level that you can get in Finland as in the US. So same thing here. And then if we look at the factors that boys and girls consider important, we see some interesting differences and interesting similarities emerge. So we basically asked, it was probably about 10 factors. For each factor, would you agree that this factor is important when you select your degree program? And they would answer that they would totally disagree somewhat, not care, agree, or totally agree. And so the two top panels are basically showing the boys and girls' interest in the field of the study program and interest in the prospective job. And not very surprisingly, both boys and girls totally agree that interest in the field and the job are very important when selecting where to go and study. In fact, girls are even more in agreement with this statement. So interest in the field and the job are the most important factors for girls and boys. If we ask about the prospective earnings and the prospective employment, again, most boys and most girls think that those factors are important, but they don't emerge as quite as important as the interest. And actually, I don't see very many gender differences here at all. So boys and girls, by and large, agree that these things are important, but they're not quite as important as the interest. So that is, if girls select themselves into less highly paying occupations, it's not because they think differently about the importance of earnings than boys. Then we ask the students to name their number one choice for educational degree program at the time of the questionnaire, and to look up in our information package the average salary per month and the average employment rate for the graduates from that particular degree program. And then we just plot that and look and see whether we see any differences emerge now by gender. And indeed we do. So here is where I think it gets very interesting. Boys and girls both said that earnings and employment matter equally much. Yet it is the girls who are in these sort of lower paying, the red bars are the girls, the blue bars are the boys again. So girls are selecting into degree programs that pay about 2,000 to 3,000 euros per month. Upwards of 60% of girls are found in those degree programs, whereas boys select into much more evenly into these degree programs by earnings, and also much more likely to apply to programs where the earnings of graduates are much higher. And it's also true for employment, which I found a little bit surprising, but boys also select programs that provide a better employment prospect later on in life. There have been a couple of explanations that people have suggested that might explain why we see these types of patterns. So one explanation that people offer is that women are just not very much into taking risks, and some of these higher paying occupations involve a lot of risk taking. So we asked a couple of risk attitude questions. So first of all, do you like taking risks on a scale of 1 to 10? Boys and girls equally much like or dislike risks, so we don't see any differences emerging there. It could be, of course, the case that they think of risky activities being different things, but that's fine. The second question is sort of more economics related. We offer them a picture of two different occupations. We say, assume that these occupations are equally interesting to you. Occupation number one offers you higher average wage, but also a wider wage distribution. So that could be considered a high risk, high wage occupation. Whereas the second occupation, equally interesting for you in terms of the job content, offers you a lower average wage, but also a much narrower wage distribution. So this is a low risk distribution. And here we see that girls are much more likely to pick the lower average wage, but lower kind of risk related to the wage occupation. So there's perhaps something related to risk attitudes that could be behind the results as well. And from our point of view, of course, the most interesting question is whether some of the selection into educational degrees and occupations that are lower paying by girls is related to lack of information. So do they just simply not know quite enough about the expected earnings in various occupations? We asked them, first of all, quite straight out, do you feel like you know enough about the effect of education on earnings? Girls are much more likely to say that no, they don't know quite enough. If I split this same information also by family education, so if their parents had higher education, we would also see that boys from less educated backgrounds are much less knowledgeable about the effect of education on earnings. And then in the second question, we asked the students to tell us whether the actual salary in their number one choice at the time of the questionnaire was more, less, or the same as they expected. And again, girls are much more likely to say that the salary was less than they expected. So they were negatively surprised about the expected salary in their chosen fields of education at the time. Okay, and so to cap this off, if we then look at about 6 months to a year later, where the girls actually ended up applying, where the boys ended up applying, we see that this sort of pattern of lower average expected earnings for girls versus boys is also evident in the actual application. So girls indeed did apply to programs where the average monthly incomes or earnings of the graduates are lower than boys. So they're in this 2,000 to 3,000 euro range in my graph, whereas boys are found in the much higher ranges in the 3 to 4 and up to 5,000 euros a month range relative to the girls. And enrollment, if anything, where girls ended up enrolling, that the picture is even more stark. So it definitely persisted through the whole experiment and through the whole application and enrollment process. So let me now then kind of backtrack a little bit and tell you about the data. We've done our experiment, and usually the approach is then to try to reach the students again for follow-up. So once you have reached your students for the intervention, then you'll have to figure out where they ended up going. The good news in Finland is that this is done very easily via central application registers. So all university and polytechnic applications have to be done centrally in Finland, and they all get recorded in the register of applications. So once we have done our intervention in the treatment schools, we can get the follow-up data for the treatment as well as the control schools from this register. So we get all the information on who applied where, who took the entry exam, who was accepted where, and who ended up going to which university program. We also know what their matriculation exam grades were, so how well their high school career paid off and where they lived. And since we know their exact address, we can also figure out from another database what their neighborhood exactly looks like. So on a very fine cell grid, we know whether that was a highly educated neighborhood, high income neighborhood, or what kind of demographics were evident in their neighborhood. And there's going to be a lot of very deeply involved econometrics done on these data, but I'm not going to go into that in any great detail today. I'll just mention that we did 2 types of analysis. So we can look at the university and polytechnic applications and see if the distributions of applications changed as a result of our intervention. Since we know the distribution from prior year before any intervention was done, and we know what happened after the intervention, we can look at the 2 distributions and see if they changed, if the applications shifted towards fields where students were positively surprised about the earnings. We can also look at individual persons and see if the people who were exposed to this information actually added more of the high-paying educational degrees into their application portfolios. And we can look at the enrollment and expected earnings among those who enrolled in various degree programs. And here's one example of what we did. So for example, here we could look at on the X-axis, the average updating of wage expectations, whether people were positively or negatively surprised about the wages. And then on the Y-axis, the change of applications. And here you could see simply a positive relationship. So students who were positively surprised about the expected earnings increased their applications to programs where the surprises were positive, and vice versa for the negative surprises. And you could do the same thing in a regression framework. And most of our analysis we have done sort of boys and girls, and also splitting boys and girls into low and high education backgrounds. And here again we can see the result. We can see that boys from low education neighborhoods changed their application behavior. We don't see any change for boys from high education backgrounds, and we also see absolutely nothing for girls. So even though girls and boys from less educated backgrounds were the ones who were most surprised and most negatively surprised, it's only the boys who changed their application behavior so far. We also looked at the actual persons in our questionnaire sample, so who told us exactly like the wages in the field that I was going to apply were less than I expected, same as I expected, more than I expected. And we saw that the people who were negatively surprised were the exact persons who also were less likely to apply to the programs that they said that they would apply to, and it carried all the way through the enrollment. And again, we could look at the individual level analysis. So now we're looking at the expected value of the application portfolio. You could think of it as the sort of average wage in the degree programs that the person applied to. And similarly to before, we see that boys from less educated backgrounds added more of those high-paying educational degrees into their portfolios, but that was not true for girls. So they did not change the average expected value of the application portfolio like the boys did. And so this was applications. If we look at enrollment, things get a little less clear cut, and a big reason is that students who apply are by no means guaranteed to get an entry, an educational degree program placement in the first year after they apply. It's only about a third of high school students in Finland who actually get into the program of their choice, and so most students will have to do multiple years of application before they actually are accepted to a program that they want to be in. And so we don't see any impact on enrollment in the following fall. We don't even see it for the boys who came from the less educated background. So they did apply to higher paying educational degree programs, but they didn't actually end up getting into the programs to any greater extent. And so simply to conclude, I think the information that we provided shows that girls do select into lower paying educational degrees and lower paying occupations based on their interest. So it's not that they don't care about the earnings, or that they don't know, that they don't know enough, or even when they do know enough or don't know enough, they don't change the application behavior with this new information that we provided. We do see that boys from low education backgrounds change their application behavior. And while these results are still preliminary and we're still working through the mechanics of the study, our take today is that it looks like better information could level the playing field, especially when it relates to family background. We do see that less educated students from less educated family backgrounds know less, and there is some scope for them changing their decision making as a result of having better information and new information. This type of information experiment is not very expensive to do, especially given the current internet access that almost everyone has. So it's cheap to do, so even small gains would justify something like this information being distributed to all students. what was interesting was that students are able to absorb relatively complex information. So we didn't just tell them about average earnings and average employment. We showed them distributions of these things, and they were clearly able to understand what was going on here. So we should give them credit for being able to understand complicated information. And our thinking is, we don't have any proof for this, but we would think that an earlier intervention might be more efficient in affecting behavior. And the reason for that is that by the third year of high schools, a lot of decisions have already been made, and a lot of choices have already been locked in. So students have decided whether they want to do advanced math or advanced physics, and they can't sort of backtrack those choices. So an earlier intervention could be the way to go. And also, since the girls especially said that their interest in the job was the most important thing, we might want to include information on job characteristics, job satisfaction, and think about actual role models that might affect the girls thinking about education more than just the average earnings and average employment do. Thank you very much, and have a good day.